Okay, so I kind of forgot the topic, but I think it is what's going to happen with VR in 2016. But I think rather the question would be what needs to happen in 2016. And I can start with, perhaps I'll start with you, Mike.
So the question is what needs to happen in VR in 2016?
Yeah.
So as an early stage investor, I live in the world of the future. So when I'm talking about how exciting VR is, I'm talking about the world I'm imagining 5 or 10 years from now. And there are applications that are really interesting now, but the answer is everything needs to start happening. So with the Oculus and the HTC coming out, we'll get some really high-end experiences available to the consumer for the first time. And we're going to learn a lot. I don't know if anyone remembers like the first Mac that came out. I wasn't alive, so I don't remember that. But I imagine the computers today are way better than then. And I think we have to remember that's where we are in VR. So we have to start getting early adopters to start playing with this and learning. We have to start building the market. There is no market. We have to start playing with business models. There are no business models. We have to keep investing in it. There's still relatively little investment. And we have to build amazing content and applications because this is a medium that lives and dies by the quality of its content.
Yeah. That's a lot. I mean, that's a long to-do list.
Everything needs to happen.
Yeah. That's a mouthful. I mean, that's incredible. What do you say?
I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, those kind of technologies are driven by content. And I think that, content creation for VR is something that, we don't know how to do it yet, right? I mean, we have games. Those are obvious things that we think is going to work. But the question is like, movies, for example, linear storytelling. What is storytelling for an immersive environment? How can we, and I think in addition to content creation, right? So there is this problem, if you have nowadays, I mean, from a technical standpoint, nowadays for, YouTube, everything, you can film everything from your cell phone. But the problem is a three-dimensional, scene, it's like exponentially more complex, right? I mean, you want to create this content, how can you create this? Right now, you need a complete pipeline, a production pipeline, in order to create something that is even useful. And it's really difficult to democratize these kind of technologies. I think the second problem is basically these type of technologies are, I think, it will happen, but it will take a couple of years to actually have something that is ergonomic enough and something where you don't feel sick at all, and you can actually really use.
Yeah. No, it's actually interesting. I mean, I would say if there are a couple of things just to tack on to that. Our experience as a VR game developer is certainly that the hardware is ready. I mean, that is just an awesome milestone that we've hit as an industry. I mean, basically looking at CV1 from Oculus, HTC Vive in the partnership with Valve, and then of course PlayStation VR, each of these platforms is good enough. In fact, they're awesome. So that's check, job done. First generation of high immersion VR is ready to go next year. The problem is we now need to make content that doesn't suck. And that's a huge challenge still. There are a lot of enthusiast developers making VR, but there are relatively few still that have kind of the team makeup or the funding to actually create AAA experiences and content. And it's down to us as content developers to not create an epic fail for the launch of this industry, because it is the content that will drive excitement. And we have to get it right. So we can't ship games that make people sick. That's just impossible to do. And frankly, and this is my personal opinion, we can't ship a huge amount of spherical 360 video, because that is a novelty aspect of VR. Real modern game engines like Unity or Epic's Unreal 4 are where it's at. You have to create interactive, immersive experiences. It's not enough to be a passive consumer of VR, in my opinion.
So how many units of these high-end devices need to sell next year? I mean, throw out a number. How many units would have to sell to make this, give this market some boost, some impetus?
Look, I think this is just like at year zero of every new hardware platform. I mean, if you're a smart developer or publisher of content, you're going to adjust your budget to what you think the install base and the sell-through is going to be in the first year. You're necessarily games and content shipping in year one of VR might be smaller. They're probably not going to be $60 games with 40 hours of playthrough time. But they're going to be short, perfectly formed gems of content. And that doesn't have to be hugely expensive. So if you're doing your calculation correctly as a developer, you craft a budget that assumes a fairly moderate install base, and you go from there. And then, of course, year 2 and 3, this grows and ramps from there.
Okay. Maybe some people compare VR today, where sort of 3D printing was a couple of years ago. It's the next big thing. It's an awesome technology. Everyone needs to have a 3D printer at home. I mean, it's a given, right? It's an amazing thing.
I think, there was a little bit of a hype, right? I mean, 3D printing like last year or the year before, everyone thought, it's going to be a game changer. Everyone's going to have these things at home. But, I have discussions with other researchers. I mean, I live in an academic world, so we do a lot of research in, in computer graphics. There's a lot of research in 3D printing, fabrication, and we talked to other professors, and they think that it's not necessarily something that will become big at home, right? So they think it's really like B2B kind of applications, where more for industrial grade applications, where it's going to be useful. So I think for consumers it will still take a while.
Yeah,
it's too slow.
Yeah. What are the real risks that people? What are the real risks you see when you step into companies? Why are the reasons you would turn down like a fledgling VR startup looking for funding?
Why do they get turned down?
Yeah, what would be what are problems you see?
Well, there's two different really important risks, at least. So there's the overall market risk. So I just mentioned that there has to be an entire ecosystem get built with the market has to be built, distribution channels, content. It's very, very expensive to build AAA content and very hard, but it's still critical because you don't want to get sick. So that's why we made an ecosystem play. That's why we're investing in 50, because this is like Xerox PARC or something, where to have a PC work, you actually have to have the mouse, and you have to have, you have to figure out the interface, and you have to do all of that. And so with VR, we're still figuring out all of that at the same time. So what we're doing is we're not only investing in 50 companies now by the end of next year, we talk to all of the other major venture capital funders in the US, and a lot of them have invested in companies we have by those communications. So one of the big market risks is how long that will take. It's going to take years, not months. And so in the middle, normally a business model would help you out. And because the industry is starting at the same time, I don't believe you can depend on that either. Your models of how many things will get sold and what people are going to buy are going to be as good as the inputs in them, which are worthless. And so these companies are dependent on being very, very lean and supplementing whatever they're missing with venture capital. And so they have to build a long enough runway. So when we invest in companies, we look for very, very lean companies that have a leg up on all of their competitors in the ecosystem, and then we try to de-risk the systematic risk by making a big play across the ecosystem. It's very risky. That's what happens when you're investing in ponds and lakes. You need them to grow to oceans. When they do, they're valuable, and when they don't, they're 3D printing.
Can you tell us something about some upcoming applications that you're excited about?
Yeah, so to add to some of the ones I was mentioning in the talk, for example, in architecture, a lot of architects actually build 3D models before they build the homes or the commercial type buildings. So with VR, one of our companies called Inside VR, you can actually walk through those buildings before they're built, and I think that's a less expensive way to make changes. Going back to the education thing, I don't know what I wouldn't rather learn by experiencing it. And so when you start to think about education and the things we're trying to learn with history or spatial recognition, but then you also think about things like travel and trying to understand the world through empathy by really understanding what other places are like, and then how fun gaming is, because gaming is really interactive, and then experiences. They all merge, I think. Just like VR and AR merge, so do all these things. Because why can't learning be super fun? Because there's certain times in real life where learning is really, really fun. And a lot of that has to do with what kind of environment you're perceiving. And VR can actually make that bridge. I'm extremely jealous of kids like 20 or 30 years from now and the way they're going to get to learn. It's going to be, it's just going to be outrageously amazing.
Yeah, you have. I mean, you must have looked at this sort of stuff too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways to actually see how VR is it's really teleportation, right? It's really putting yourself in a different place. And I think one of the biggest things, or the biggest potential of things that it could actually solve is the energy problem, right? So, for example, now if I need to meet someone, right? So in terms of communication, if I need to meet you, I need to like fly over, to another place to have a real intimate meeting, right? Where we can have eye-to-eye contacts. So I think in VR, if we could solve communication in some ways, then we don't need to like fly over. So in terms of like transportation, it would be a lot more energy efficient, right? So we could really solve the remote communication problem. So telepresence, I think, will have an entirely different meaning.
Yeah, it's actually interesting with telepresence. When I tried the toy box demo from Oculus for the first time this summer,
right.
The mistake everyone makes when they think about virtual reality is they think about Neil Stephenson and Snow Crash, and they want to do fully articulated avatars and do the cool stuff that you guys are doing like tomorrow.
Right.
Like, and do it all at once. And we need that all to happen to get social VR and telepresence. But what actually Oculus proved with the toy box demo is you need accurate tracking of the head.
Yeah.
You need 3D positional audio, so you hear the 3D voice of the person speaking with you, and you need hands and basic gesture recognition. Those 4 points are enough. The kind of the visceral sense of someone else being in that simulation with you was actually much better than any expensive video telepresence suite I've seen, in the past, where people are trying to do video conferencing, trying to do these very expensive suites, et cetera. All it took in VR was a cartoon character, a head, a 3D voice, and hands. And you just bought into the fact that someone was there with you. And I think that is going to be absolutely huge as an application, just communications in VR, but in a much more abstract visual sense than perhaps many of us assumed when we took a page out of the book of sci-fi authors and thought that would be the metaverse, right?
Yeah. Right. I think the main difference is really like what are the factors that actually make this thing more interesting. And I think you're pretty much right? So basically the low-hanging fruit here is actually high frame rate, low latency, and that really makes you just be there somehow, even if it's just a very low-dimensional representation of yourself. If things are missing, but we can imagine that these things will come.
I mean, the cool thing about VR is that the baseline is already there. I mean, the research and the stuff you guys are doing at USC is awesome. I mean, it shows us the path for what's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 20 years for everyone, right?
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not, maybe not, who knows? But kind of to my point earlier, the base platform, the hardware stack, the software stack, it's there from a content perspective and from the perspective of creating meaningful experiences that people can share. I mean, I think that is a huge opportunity for VR going forward, and it's good enough now. We don't have to wait for 2017, 2018. It's happening next year, and that's awesome.
So when's Slush going to be done by VR rather than people coming here?
Well, at the point that they were able to simulate sauna, vodka, and crayfish, then we don't need to come to Finland anymore. But I have a feeling that's going to be a while yet.
Can you talk about some of the challenges as a game maker, a content maker? What are the constraints you face?
Sure.
With the technology as it stands today?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things really quickly just to point out. The first one, which is a challenge for everyone beginning to develop for VR, is how do you get to full frame rate, so high performance in the game that you're creating. Just matching your technical budget, your art budget, with the underlying performance of the hardware is non-trivial. And that's kind of the first task that you have to master. Or you can adapt your art style if you don't have the team that can pull off very high-end kind of hyper-real graphics, and you go to more cartoony type of experiences. But the second thing, and once you've mastered that, and that's kind of a given if you're a competent studio that you'll get that right. The second part is harder, which is how do you actually design for variable input methods across the different platforms. So right now, if we look just at the high immersion platforms like Rift, PlayStation, and Vive, they all have different input methods. So on Rift, we've got an Xbox One controller, then we have touch. On PlayStation, we have the DualShock 4 and possibly Move controllers if you choose to support those. And then on Vive, it's hand controllers and room scale tracking. So as a game developer, and particularly in our case where we're trying to create games that will run across all of these platforms, that's probably the hardest design challenge. So you have to change the scale of the experience, how you navigate through it, and that's a pretty fundamental reworking of the UX layer at the point that you're actually starting to test with real players. And that's probably the most challenging aspect of development at the moment. I think we'll get there. I mean, this is not an intractable problem, but it adds a level of complexity for game developers that it's tough. But over time, of course, I think we'll see convergence in the input technologies. So this will be more similar across the different platforms, 2-3 years out.
Is this what you're seeing as well? I mean, when you talk to game developers, are they saying the same things?
Yes, he is an expert.
Yeah, but but so what else? Is there something else that they talk about, or what are the sort of problems they bring to you that you can help them with aside from funding?
I think we're all in this sort of waiting period where it's supposed to be 2015 that a lot of these platforms came out, and they're right to wait because they weren't quite there on a couple of fronts. When you have a really bad experience in VR, it could be pretty bad, because I think VR lives at a place closer to your memory. That's the power of it, and that's also the downside of it. So it's like it's the Spider-Man thing. You got great power, so you have to have great responsibility. And so when I think a lot of these types of VR companies were thinking about trying to get this out in time for this holiday season, and there's a lot of hype behind it, and they're right to push it because it isn't quite ready. So all these game developers, it doesn't make sense to push these out if you're a high-quality AAA game on an Android or an iPhone. You're just not going to get there. So you have to wait for these high-end platforms, and there are, I think, a number of very high-quality games that are short and brief, and that's because of how hard they are to make per minute. And we're still learning and experimenting. So the biggest challenge really is starting to experiment with the market. We're kind of in a holding pattern on that.
So I just want to pick up on one point there. There's been this kind of common description of costs per minute of VR game production is higher. I think Bing Gordon had the first comment about this, where he was assuming that the cost per minute was twice that of a AAA console game. I actually disagree with that. That's not our experience as a studio, because the thing that you have to account for when you're developing at AAA visual quality is, yes, you've got some complexity and cost in your asset production, but you're also not creating a game like Call of Duty where you burn through the content in a corridor-based shooter where beautiful content flies past you in literally a second, and then you move on in the game. In VR, what I think most of us are developing for are scenes that are slower paced, where you take more time to inspect kind of the beauty of a flower, or a peak in the case of Everest. You spend more time with the content, immersed with it, than you would in a traditional AAA console game. So I, at least from our experience, we haven't seen this kind of massive doubling in cost that I think some people are assuming will be the case. It just, again, comes down to whether you're being smart about how you're designing your game. Are you doing a game that's really content heavy and is player versus environment, which is expensive? I know that from the MMO space. We saw a lot of multi-$100-million projects flame and burn because they didn't understand that aspect of game design. So you have to do games that are more sandbox-based, that are more based upon physics simulation, for example, and allowing the player to actually have that sense of control and agency and play with it. Minecraft for VR was huge when Carmack announced that for Gear VR and for Rift at Oculus Connect, because that is the kind of the epitome of a sandbox-style game, and those are the kinds of games that I think will work really well for VR over the next few years, because on balance, they're less expensive to actually produce than the classical kind of player versus environment games.
I'd like to build on that from an investor perspective. So the cost per minute may not be more than a AAA game on a console, but the cost per user can be 100 times more. So we have almost no users, and we do believe that there will be, and there's a growth curve. Mm-hmm. But when you're looking at the potential market and the willingness to pay, I do believe that for high-quality VR content, the willingness to pay will ultimately be higher, maybe meaningfully higher. But where we are in the market, with there being effectively almost no market, but there will be one, and there's expectations, we have to discount quite a bit what it'll be what it could be to what it could be reality. So as an investor, we do look at the cost, but we also look at the potential value, and we think it's huge, but we don't necessarily think it's in the next 1 or 2 years, which means that we're still kind of in R&D even when we're shipping, because that means that the first 500,000 people to try it are really all guinea pigs, and we're going to keep learning and learning. So as an investor, that's kind of the scary part, is to really be funding an entire industry of R&D.
As a final question, just were any of you ever skeptics, VR skeptics?
What was that?
Were you ever a virtual reality skeptic at some point? Skeptic? Have you ever been skeptical of the VR?
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, it's something that you have to wear, and it's like, at this point, not that comfortable, and there are like physical limitations. So from a technical standpoint, I wouldn't like always say like, it's going to be a solved problem, right? So there are things that a lot of researchers actually, I mean, it's good that there's a lot of investment in that field, but some things are just fundamentally difficult, right? So for instance, building real light-filled displays where you can actually really feel that you are inside. It's not that trivial, but I'm very positive about all that. But I think one really, really difficult problem is one thing that we didn't mention is the uncanny valley problem. So, for instance, if you want to like recreate something that is realistic, nowadays we can things that are fairly realistic. But once you are immersed in this digital world, you expect a lot more, right? Because you can actually inspect that physical world by looking things at very close distance. But then you cannot lose the fidelity, right? If I go closer to you, I would expect like to see the pores. And there's a complexity of geometry in there, but then there's also the question of how do you create the content, right? These things are still very difficult to produce in film production, which we know. I mean, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but for real-time content, so there are some things that we need to think about, right?
Yeah, I would agree with you on the uncanny valley. I mean, that's just a perennial issue for video games and computer graphics. It's not going away. It gets more pronounced in VR. Definitely, I agree with that. I think to the question of whether I was a skeptic, I mean, I tried, in San Francisco back in the 90s, I tried some of the early VR headsets that were out then. I was working in multi-user 3D software at the time. They were kind of bad, First generation VR in the 90s did not quite live up to expectations, but I think that point is so often overstated. It's like saying back in 1995 that mobile phones are never going to be big because they kind of suck today. It's a horrible comparison.
Yeah.
All we needed for VR to take off was processing power, screen displays, all of the things that came through miniaturization and cost reduction in the mobile phone space directly applied to making VR possible from a hardware perspective. And again, now it's good enough. So I am, color me no longer skeptical.
Yes. Actually, by being frontier technology investors, we're skeptical of everything we invest in. And so is everyone else. So what we do is, just to keep using the analogy of the ponds and lakes, like those are all small enough bodies of water that they could dry up. And so we have invested in, space companies like SpaceX and a company called Worldview and Planet Labs, but we're not trying to do 50 space companies. I don't see them. We only did one 3D printed company. It was called Souls, and it does 3D printed soles for your feet, and it's incredible. And we still haven't done any others because we think it's still kind of a small pond. And when we invested in Matterport, we were not skeptical in the founders, but we were skeptical in the market. And so we're kind of skeptical by nature, but then the thing that changed was when we thought that the technical risk went to zero. It works. Yeah. That's unbelievable. There's no doubt. People have known for decades that if VR ever worked, it would be totally mind-blowing, and it is, and it works. If you haven't tried mind-blowing VR, try what he's making, or try what some of these other people here are making, because there's not a lot of it yet. There will be a lot of it in the future, but please find it and try it. And next year, when we're speaking here, let's have all of you be founders of VR companies.
Okay, that's a great way to end this little talk. So, it's time for us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Okay.